6,000 farmers with sharpened farming tools against 12,000 armored knights. Those aren't underdog odds. Those are extinction statistics. Those are the numbers that appear in military disaster textbooks as examples of what happens when untrained peasants face professional medieval armies. Except on the 11th of September 1297, at a narrow wooden bridge in Scotland, something impossible happened. By sunset, 5,000 English soldiers lay dead, many drowned in the River Forth while trapped in 80 pounds of steel armor, their screams echoing across water they couldn't escape. And their commander? His skin was peeled from his corpse in strips and turned into sword belts. This is the story of how William Wallace transformed a bridge barely wide enough for two horses into history's most perfect killing ground. Here's what will shock you. The English commander was warned multiple times about the trap. His own Scottish knight begged him to use a nearby ford where the entire army could cross safely in hours. But pride, greed, and a fat treasurer's impatience led 12,000 professional soldiers to march single file into a death trap so obvious that medieval chroniclers still argue about whether Surrey was incompetent or simply suicidal. The mathematics were brutal. At the crossing rate of 2 armored knights every 30 seconds, moving the cavalry alone would take over 8 hours. 8 hours of feeding your army piece by piece into a bottleneck where the enemy controlled the high ground and could attack whenever they wanted. Every military manual ever written says this is suicide. Surrey did it anyway. And what followed was medieval warfare's most devastating lesson in why geography defeats technology, why patience beats power, and why sometimes the simplest trap is the deadliest. To understand how farmers destroyed knights, you need to understand what Edward I had done to Scotland. The man who earned the title Hammer of the Scots had practiced his techniques in Wales first, brutal, methodical, designed to break not just armies, but spirits. When he turned his attention to Scotland in 1296, he brought that same merciless efficiency. The Berwick Massacre was his opening statement. English soldiers entered the Scottish border town and spent an entire day methodically killing civilians. When the screaming finally stopped, 7,500 bodies, men, women, children, even priests, clutching crosses, lay in the streets. Edward's message was crystal clear: submit completely or watch everything you love burn. The ragman rolls followed a humiliation designed to crush Scottish pride forever. Every Scottish noble was forced to sign documents acknowledging Edward as their overlord, swearing loyalty to England, essentially admitting that Scotland had no right to exist as an independent nation. Those who refused had their lands seized, their families imprisoned, their futures erased. King John Balliol, Scotland's legitimate monarch, sat locked in the Tower of London, a prisoner in his own kingdom's conqueror's capital. Scotland seemed finished. No leadership, no hope, no army. Just occupied territory waiting to be digested by the English Empire. But Edward made a critical mistake. He appointed Hugh de Cressingham as treasurer of occupied Scotland. Cressingham was everything the Scots despised. Grossly obese medieval chroniclers describe him as barely able to mount a horse. Openly corrupt, he taxed Scottish churches to fund English wars while pocketing massive amounts, and casually cruel. He reportedly enjoyed humiliating Scottish nobles more than collecting their money. He embodied occupation's worst face, turning resentment into hatred, hatred into rebellion. Into this powder keg stepped 2 unlikely champions who would unite a broken nation. William Wallace was minor nobility at best. His family had some status, but not enough to matter in the great game of medieval politics. What he had was personal rage. English soldiers had killed his father. When Wallace married in secret to avoid English attention, Sheriff William Heselrigg of Lanark discovered it and murdered Wallace's wife. Some accounts say in front of him, others that he returned to find her corpse. The specifics matter less than the result. In May 1297, Wallace and a group of friends stormed Lanark, killed Heselrigg and his garrison, and sparked a rebellion that would change British history. Andrew Moray was different northern nobility whose lands had been seized by English occupation. While Wallace had charisma and fury, Moray possessed something rarer, genuine tactical genius. He understood siege warfare, supply logistics, and how to coordinate multiple forces. The two men had never met when they separately raised rebellions. Wallace in the south and west, Moray in the north. But when they finally joined forces in summer 1297, they created something unprecedented, a unified Scottish resistance that controlled everything north of the River Forth. Farmers grabbed scythes. Blacksmiths forged spear points from farming tools. Outlaws emerged from forests where they'd been hiding from English law. And slowly, impossibly, an army formed not professional soldiers, but men who decided that dying free was preferable to living as slaves. By September, the situation had become intolerable for English occupation. Wallace and Moray weren't just raiding, they were governing, collecting taxes, administering justice, essentially running Scotland as though Edward's conquest had never happened. The English response was overwhelming force, designed to crush this rebellion permanently. John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, received orders to march north and destroy the Scottish resistance. Surrey was no amateur. He was a veteran commander who had fought in Wales, understood rebellion, suppression, and commanded respect from professional soldiers. With him came the pride of English medieval military power, 2,000 heavy cavalry, each knight encased in 60 to 80 pounds of steel plate armor. Riding destriers, war horses bred specifically for combat, worth fortunes, and trained to trample infantry. 8,000 professional infantry who fought in coordinated formations, Welsh longbowmen, fresh from conquering their own homeland, now aiming at Scotland, plus support troops, supply wagons, siege equipment, everything needed to crush a rebellion. The total force approached 12,000 men, and every single one was confident of easy victory. They were professional soldiers facing farmers. The outcome seemed predetermined, but here's where medieval physics becomes important. A mounted knight in full armor, with weapons, shield, and equipment, carried approximately 250 pounds total weight. Their destriers weighed around 1,500 pounds. On solid, flat ground, this combination was devastating. An armored cavalry charge could break almost any infantry formation through sheer momentum and mass. But momentum is a merciless master that doesn't distinguish between friend and enemy. That same weight that made knights unstoppable on flat ground became a death sentence in water. Plate armor doesn't have zippers or quick-release buckles. Medieval armor was designed to be put on with assistance and couldn't be removed quickly, especially by the person wearing it. Fall into water wearing 80 pounds of steel, and you have perhaps 30 seconds before you sink and drown, not enough time to unbuckle even a breastplate, let alone full harness. Wallace and Moray understood this physics intimately. They also understood something else: the skiltron. This wasn't a traditional Scottish formation, it was relatively new, possibly adapted from Flemish tactics. The schiltron was essentially a circular or rectangular formation of spearmen, each armed with pikes 12 to 14 feet long, positioned so densely that the weapons created an impenetrable hedge of steel points extending far beyond the formation. A knight's sword reached perhaps 4 to 5 feet. A knight's lance was maybe 10 to 12 feet. But schiltron spears extended 14 feet, meaning cavalry literally couldn't reach the men holding them without impaling themselves or their horses on multiple pike points simultaneously. Common men standing together in proper formation could create a wall that elite cavalry couldn't penetrate. It was mathematical superior reach plus disciplined formation equals dead horses and unhorsed knights who become vulnerable targets. The commanders positioned their forces with brilliant tactical insight. Abbey Craig, a volcanic rock formation north of Stirling Bridge, offered perfect elevation to observe everything happening below. From its heights, they could literally count individual English soldiers, watch formations deploy, time movements to the second. The slope provided momentum for downhill charges, gravity as weapon. Most critically, the ground north of Stirling Bridge was marshy, soft, waterlogged terrain where heavy cavalry would bog down, lose mobility, become sitting targets. And the bridge itself was the perfect choke point. 60 feet long, barely 6 feet wide, only strong enough to handle light traffic, now expected to support the weight of thousands of armored soldiers and horses. It was a disaster waiting for someone to trigger it. Wallace and Moray positioned their army to be that trigger. On September 10, Surrey held a war council that would haunt him forever. His officers gathered to discuss how to engage the Scottish forces visible on Abbey Craig. Sir Richard Lundy, a Scottish knight fighting for England, familiar with the terrain, offered critical intelligence. "My lord, there's a ford at Drip, perhaps 2 miles upstream. 60 horsemen could cross abreast there. We could have the entire army across in a few hours and flank Wallace's position. He's chosen his ground, assuming we'll use the bridge. Surprise him." It was perfect tactical advice. But then Hugh de Cressingham intervened with the words that would kill thousands. More delays? "Every day we wait costs the king's treasury gold we can't afford. These rebels are farmers with pitchforks. They'll scatter at the first charge, cross the bridge at dawn, and finish this." The tension in that moment was palpable. Surrey was experienced enough to recognize sound advice, but Cressingham controlled finances and had political connections Surrey lacked. Worse, Cressingham's accusations stung. Was Surrey being cautious or cowardly? Medieval military culture prized aggressive action over defensive thinking.